Good evening and welcome to Naples United Church of Christ. It is a privilege to welcome you to this sacred conversation on race and privilege, the first week as we begin this 8-week series. My name is Dawson Taylor and I have the great privilege of serving as senior minister. And again, we are grateful to have you with us as we begin this dialogue. This evening, we begin something that was not on any programmatic schedule for this year. I'm not proud of that, but it is the truth. On the weekend of my installation as senior minister 3 years ago, President Ray's predecessor, Dr. Alice Hunt, presented a workshop on white privilege. But other than that, I don't really have a memory that we've done intentional programming on addressing racism or white privilege during my tenure until tonight. Yes, I've mentioned racism from the pulpit. We've hosted events for the NAACP of Collier and Naples, as well as Surge, Stand Up for Racial Justice. And at our most recent church council meeting, we formed a justice committee. But it was not until the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd that as a Christian, a young white man of privilege raised in the South, and a pastor of the gospel, that we have intentionally designed this series of sacred conversations. So I want to begin tonight with the confession of my own sin and short-sightedness. If I have underestimated this congregation and their ability to enter into this dialogue, I'm sorry. I know that the dialogue around race and privilege are difficult, and I know that it can be divisive. But I have wept as I learned that it's possible that Ahmaud Arbery heard racial slurs just before his death, and that Breonna Taylor would have celebrated her 27th birthday this past Friday, and that George Floyd and I come from the same hometown, and that he cried out for his deceased mother as he lay dying at the hands of white police officers. So this evening, we begin this sacred work. I'm grateful to be joined by my clergy colleagues, Reverend Dr. David Kaiser-Cross, our executive minister, Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser-Cross, Minister for Congregational Care, who we are glad is back in the saddle after a bike accident this weekend, and of course, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, our assistant minister. Tonight, we are joined by two esteemed colleagues, and if I may be so bold, people that I also call friends. They share something in common. They have both graced the pulpit of this church and have been well received. Reverend Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson serves as pastor of First United Church of Tampa, Florida. Dr. Jackson is an activist on behalf of human and civil rights, women's rights, and has been an advocate for peace with justice and ecumenism around the world, including serving as president of the North American region of the World Council of Churches for 9 years. Serving on the United Church of Christ national staff for nearly 2 decades, Dr. Jackson was the founding executive minister of Justice and Witness Ministries and one of 5 officers of the denomination. Prior to that, she served as the director of the Bishop Tutu Southern African Refugee Scholarship Fund, where she was also the Archbishop's U.S. representative. She is a graduate of Wilson College and holds master's degrees from the Columbia University School of Journalism and Union Theological Seminary, and received honorary Doctor of Humane Letter degrees from Defiance College and the Florida Center for Theological Studies. Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr. is the president of Chicago Theological Seminary. In addition, he is president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Having written and lectured broadly in the areas of systematic theology, African American religion, human rights, and the intersection of religion and politics, President Ray's current work focuses on reinvigorating the public square as a place for all and reclaiming a vital expression of progressive religion in that project. President Ray earned his PhD in Religious Studies, African American Studies joint degree from Yale University and is a summa cum laude graduate of Yale Divinity School. He holds a bachelor's degree from Charter Oak State College in Connecticut and a certificate in Black Ministries from Hartford Seminary. Welcome, Bernice. Welcome, Stephen. And again, our deepest gratitude to you both for being with us. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions that the clergy team has been brainstorming for over a week now. Are we living in a watershed moment currently? And depending on how you view that, how do you believe that we have gotten to where we are as a nation? Stephen, why don't you start?
Well, first, let me thank you for the kind and generous invitation to be with you for this important conversation. So I would say that we are at a watershed moment for two reasons. One, and I think most specifically, is that what we're seeing and where much of this emerges from is that in terms of our body politic, one of the things that has come to the fore ferociously is the question of who we are as a society and what we will be as a society. And that's been playing itself out certainly across Twitter, across many of our social media, but then also across every television screen, making a stark choice of what kind of society we'll be and what kind of world we're trying to create. I think this particular moment, which I think is transformative, was set in place by the reality that the current administration, within its first 2 months, vacated every single consent decree. Now, for those who don't know what a consent decree is, what it is that it was an agreement entered into by law enforcement agencies with histories of abuse and racial discrimination after they had been sued by the Department of Justice in court. And a consent decree was what was used to paint steps for mediation, to improve the policing, to improve the relationship of the police within the communities that they are part of. And as I said, within the first 2 months of this administration back in 2017, every single one of those consent decrees was vacated. And so what ended up happening then was that began and has only gotten worse, a climate in which police departments, particularly ones with histories of discrimination, ones with histories of abuse and excessive force, were not accountable to anyone. And so as a consequence, this has really been a snowballing effect, but it's not unconnected to the vision of our society and the struggle that we're having right now as to, does this society belong to all of us, or does it belong to just a few people and the rest of us just happen to live here? And so it's a transformative moment, but I think it comes from a very particular history. You know, I'm not even going to talk about the long history of racial discrimination, et cetera, but I think there's a particular history in relation to the vacation of those consent decrees and the structure of permission that it put in place for police departments with history of abuse and brutality to feel as if they had no one to whom they were accountable.
Thank you for that history, Stephen. Bernice, how would you answer the question?
Well, I join Stephen in saying thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And just listening to his answer, I'm always reminded about how much of a teacher Stephen is and everything he does.
I know, right?
I think it has the potential to be a transformative moment. And I think that he is exactly right, that it is one of those moments, it's a kairos moment. You know, there's chronos time and there's kairos time, and kairos time has to do with God time. And so it's one of those moments in our nation's history, one of those kairos moments in our nation's history, where we get to make choices. Who, as Stephen said, who are we? It's a moral choice. Who do we want to become? And I think that we have the possibility of transforming into something new, where everybody is included, not just in the same room, but at the same table. It's got that kind of potential. Whether we choose to walk through that door into that new world, into that new reality, I don't think yet is answered.
Thank you. And, we were talking, Bernice, I know you're in Tampa, Stephen in Chicago. We were talking about the ways that the protests are living themselves out in our various communities and not only across the nation, but across the world. So as a follow-up to that, I had a recent experience. I was actually in the post office and overheard a conversation between two people, and they were talking about the difference between protests and looting. And I think, I do think our media has a responsibility there as well, but I wonder if, through your experience, if you differentiate that, because, I've heard people talk about, I understand the reason for the protest, but when it gets to the looting, that's where I draw the line. And so I'm just curious how you might respond to a conversation like the one I overheard.
I think I have two responses. I don't know how Stephen would respond. I remember after Katrina, after the storm in New Orleans, where 80% of the city was underwater, and where people were, many hundreds or perhaps thousands of people were stuck in their homes. They couldn't get out because of the floods. And there were pictures of people going into stores, getting stuff out of stores, and the media immediately called them looters. Well, they weren't looters. They were people who had no food. They were stuck up in the attics, a few people coming out to get supplies, diapers or whatever. So there is that part of the reality that sometimes the media is fast to, and the rest of us are fast to label people. But I think the other part of reality, often you hear the conversation about, when you talk about police officers and the kinds of abuses that we've been talking a lot about over the last few weeks, you often hear people say, 95% of police officers are good. And that's probably true. Well, 95% of the protesters are people out there peaceably protesting, and you always are going to have a few bad apples. I don't care what you're talking, what group you're talking about. So yes, there are people who go out to do bad things, but that's 5% of the people. There's 95% meanwhile, and so we get sometimes all caught up in the 5%, not really understanding and really paying attention to the 95%. That would be my response.
No, I appreciate that. Stephen, what would you add to that?
Well, I think, a couple of things. One is to remember that the entire sort of cultural image of the looter, in terms of these moments of unrest, really was lifted up and given particular force in terms of in the 1960s as a way of both legitimating and encouraging white flight from the cities into the suburbs. I mean, because that's where the first image comes from. And so what happens over and over again is that regardless of the reality that Bernice just pointed to, that the looters have, quote unquote, never been anything remotely more than a small minority of the people who were engaged in protests, they become the face of the protest. Mm-hmm. And, so that comes to us back in the 60s, but I think more importantly, that way of reporting it functions as a way of legitimating the police use of force that led to the unrest. I mean, one of the things we sometimes forget is that if you go back to the early or mid 1860s, when the people who were rioting and looting were Irish and they were Germans and they were in New York City. Virtually every riot that there was, and that there were several, was occasioned by an act of police brutality, right? And if you go back from the period through the 60s on through now, that's always been the spark that set the match. So what ends up happening then is that when we focus on the looters, we focus on the presumption about the criminality of the Black community. And when we focus on the criminality of the Black community, not only do we then presumptively excuse the force that's been used by the police, but we also excuse all of these other practices. And, so practices, for instance, where people are policed because of where they're at, but not what they're doing, right? That they simply are in the wrong neighborhood, so that's why they get stopped by the police. And so all of this is part of, I think, a significant sort of criminalization of the Black community, and it feeds into it. So even though it's only a small group of people, and it's never been more than a small group of people, all the way from when it was the Irish and the Germans, until we're talking about Black people in cities today, but they always become the face of the entire protest. So that way it can be written off to all of these other cultural scripts we have about why people don't belong in particular places and about the presumptive criminality of particular sorts of communities. So when people want to focus on the looters, I mean, we can argue with them all day that they are a minority, but if people can't get the ideas out of their minds about Black criminality in the first place, then we'd never get anywhere with that argument, because all it takes is one looter to prove that that's really what those people are. All these other folk are just pretending to be peaceful, but we know that if we scratch the surface, all of them are just like them.
So you all understand why I enjoy Chicago Theological board meetings so much now, because we get to learn from Dr. Ray during those meetings. And I echo what Bernice said, as always a teacher. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Bernice. I'm going to stop talking because I know everyone gets to hear me talk too much anyway. So Deb, I'm going to throw it to you because I know you have some questions.
I have a question for you as well. There seems to be some discussion among white people around the language of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Could you address the distinction and why it's so important?
Well, I think if I were going to just jump in, what it is, and particularly in relation to policing, because remember that's where the figure comes from. The last time I checked, a Black person is 25 times more likely to have a lethal encounter with the police than a white person is. Now stay with that for a moment. 25 times more likely to have a lethal encounter. And so what that means then is that when we're talking about policing, because that, I mean, even though it's grown to be a larger cultural thing, that's specifically what the phrase came from. It's that the levels of lethality, I mean, here I'm not just talking about brutality, I'm talking about lethality, is such that there is a systemic disregard for the value of Black life that is demonstrably different from all lives. So that's a part of the whole logic of the thing, is that if there was anywhere near parity in terms of lethal encounters with the police, then we might be able to say that this is an issue that has to do with all people. It's an issue that has to do with Black people, white people, brown people equally. But when you have a difference of 25 times more lethal force used by the police, then what that means is that the police departments and the cultural presumptions that they represent are ones that presume that Black lives are less valuable than white lives, and that there will be a much less significant price to pay for the taking of a Black life. So I think that that's one way to think about it. If we were talking about parity, then the All Lives Matter argument would make perfect sense to me. But when we're talking about a factor of 25 times more lethality that's directed toward Black communities, then that demonstrates that there is a very specific problem with policing and the use of lethal force when we're talking about encounters with Black people in the Black community.
Thank you. Bernice.
I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. So I'm used to seeing the White House. As a child, it was not that far from where I grew up. And so right now, there's this huge fence around the perimeter, the entirety of the White House. And one of the signs on that fence was carried by one of the marchers this weekend. And it said, "We say Black lives matter. We know all lives matter, but it's Black lives that are in danger right now." And for me, that sign that's up on that fence captured what we're trying to say, not only in terms of the statistics that Stephen was talking about, but if you look at things like maternal mortality, Black women have the same mortality rates as women in Jamaica and other places in the what we call used to call the third world, which is incredible. And it's not about income. Serena Williams almost died because nobody was in childbirth because nobody listened to her. One of the most wealthiest, most well-known women, Black women in the world, who knew what kind of physical situation she had because she's been dealing with this. And they didn't listen to her. She almost died in childbirth. So if Serena Williams can almost die in childbirth, Black women are something like 6 times more likely to die in childbirth in this country. So when you say Black Lives Matter, it's not just around police brutality, which it is, but it's a whole spectrum of ways that this nation over 400 years has shown us that our lives, Black lives, are not as important, we're not fully human. And so that's why the need to have a statement like Black Lives Matter is to say our lives matter too.
Thank you.
Dr. Bernice and Dr. Ray, we're going to be carrying on these conversations for a number of weeks in a white environment with a lot of older folks who may not be very sure about the kind of language that's important to use. So we've got a difference between the term Black and the term African American. How can you help us understand which terms are appropriate to use in which contexts?
I'm slow to respond because I want to say to you, I want to push you a little bit and say that we have to get beyond worrying about whether we call Black people African American. When I grew up in Washington, D.C. as a little girl, we were colored. When I went to my first day of kindergarten, I was a Brown versus Board of Education baby. I went to the first year of integrated schools in the nation's capital. We had segregated schools in the nation's capital until I went to kindergarten. My first day of kindergarten, I'm standing in line outside, and a little child in front of me turns around and says, are you Negro or are you white? Because I'm light-skinned, so people don't always understand that. But the reason I say that is because I did not know the answer to that question. I just knew I was Bernice. I knew I was the sister of Nick. I knew I was, the child of. And I had to go home on my first day of kindergarten and ask my mother, what am I? And that began my own journey about race and racism in America. So, I mean, I'm Stephen's going to probably give you the educated response. I'm giving you the personal response. I don't really care whether you call, there are Afro-Caribbeans and people who have grown up outside of the United States who maybe aren't Americans in the traditional sense. They are Americans now, but they came they're immigrants from somewhere else. And they might not like African Americans. They might like Black. Some people like one and some people like the other. I would not spend a lot of time in this day and age with the kind of issues that we have to deal with worrying about that. That would be my advice to folks. Don't get all uptight about that. There's a lot of other stuff we can get uptight about, but that would be my feeling. Stephen, give him a much better answer than I did.
That won't be a better answer. Well, I think the way to think about it, particularly as we're looking at and specifically thinking about your audience, thinking about the people who are in your church, the people who are in your community, there's a way in which all of you remember these different ways of talking about Black people. I mean, all of you remember. So I myself, I was a Negro for my entire childhood. But then when I was coming into my adolescence, I became a Black person for a few years. But then after a few years of that, I became an Afro-American. And then I became Black again for a little while. And I became African-American for a long while. And then later in life, I simply became a Black person again. Now, all of you remember all of that, and you remember that what each of those represented was Black people trying to find a place within American society, trying to find a place and give expression to who and what we were, what our aspirations were. And many of those changes happened because of backlashes, right? So people who were African Americans were people who were claiming a different identity after the election of Ronald Reagan, which began to turn the clock back on many of the gains that had been achieved within our society economically, politically, etc. So if you remember that history and remember the simple thing about that history, that each of those moments was people trying to respond and give voice to their identity in a particular moment, then what ends up happening is that these movements don't become confusing. They're just ways that we orient ourselves. And, I always like to do a comparative analysis. Many people in your community who are certainly 60, 70, 80 years old can remember very well when people from Czechoslovakia were not white people, when people from Italy were not white people. They were very clearly something else. One of the things that I remember very clearly is I was doing some historical research, and I ran across the school records for the New Haven School District. And as late as 1942, the only white people in the school system were Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Everyone else was delineated by where they had come from on the continent. So this shifting identity is something that we're all familiar with, and all something we understand reflects changing places with people in American society. But a thumbnail way to think about it is to simply ask people, and when I say ask, I don't mean walk up to a random Black person and say, what do you call yourself? But simply be attentive to how it is that people are describing themselves in the moment. So we are in a moment of Black Lives Matter, and at least for an entire generation, particularly the millennials and the people who come after them, the Gen Xers, very rarely do you see them refer to themselves as African American. They're all Black people. So I think that for the people in your congregation, part of trying to really understand the situation is just listening to how people talk about themselves, right? Not trying to define them or put them in a box, but just listen to how they talk about themselves. And based on how they talk about themselves, that's the way you think about them. Because you understand that and you've lived through these periods yourselves, that the way that people describe themselves changes over time. I would dare say, and I could be mistaken in this, that many people in your congregation remember that their parents would have referred to themselves as WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, yet 60 years later, their children would never think about describing themselves in that way. But, so we're seeing even in white communities, a changing in the way people are describing themselves. I think, and then I'll be quiet because I know I'm taking up too much time. I think, and this is echoing something that Bernice was touching on, I think that the most dangerous thing going on now is not so much how Black people are defining themselves as either African American or Black, but how it is that there's an entire political movement that's wanting to reinscribe the identity of American so that it excludes Black people, whatever they say they are, Black or African American. I think that that's definitely the more significant issue. But, simple thumbnail answer, look at what people call themselves. And it actually makes your life a lot easier. It makes my life a lot easier as well. Because remember, it's not just white people orienting themselves to what it is that's going on with Black people. In the world through which I move, we have to ask the question, are we talking to a Latino or a Latinx, or simply a Latin person or a Hispanic person? Because there's this whole range of cultural identities. So the way you give honor to is just ask and listen to what people describe themselves.
Thank you.
This is very much a follow-up to what you have already started talking about. And we do think words matter. And so one more language question relates to the different cultural identities you've already mentioned. How would you help us to understand the difference between race and ethnicity and how that plays into this larger conversation?
Well, I think clearly just in terms of an academic approach, ethnicity describes where you come from, what your cultural patterns are, what kind of food you eat, how you inflect your language and all of that. So within the African American or Black community, however you want to describe it, there are different ethnicities. So for instance, I was raised by a woman from the South. I lived my entire life in New York and the first more than decade of ministry in New England. Those are very different people than the people from North Carolina. They eat very different food. They have a very different vernacular. They have very different experiences. So ethnicity has to do with all those cultural markers. Now, one of the things about the way race functions is that it flattens all of that so that people are just one thing. And so what that means then is that Black people have recognized ethnicity within our own community, but the larger society has resisted recognizing ethnicity in the midst of our communities in ways that they see it in everybody else's. So, I mean, you see all these German American festivals. If you go up to Maine, they celebrate the French Canadian culture. So, I mean, there are multiple places that ethnicity is celebrated, except when it comes to Black people. And that's because the category of Black, the category of race as such, is one that wants to flatten all difference. And so I think when you recognize ethnicity, you've actually made a significant sort of stride because you're actually paying attention to how people live their lives, how they talk, how they eat, how they socialize, the way they think about community. Unfortunately, we don't often encounter one another on that level. We encounter one another on the level of looking at people and trying to reduce them to whatever is the melanin content of their skin.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Dr. Jackson, would you add to that?
I guess what I would say is we always have to be mindful that race is a social construct. God didn't create that construct. We human beings created that construct. And it's important to also know the history of this nation when it comes to that social construct. So I told you about my first day of kindergarten. Well, and I said that because I'm light-skinned, people didn't necessarily know what I was. And there have been categories through American history, so that basically we define Black, Negro, or colored back then, whatever you want, what we were called back then. It ended up being one drop of Black blood, one drop, and you were Black. That's a social construct. It makes no sense when you think about it. It's silly when you think about it. And how we use it to determine entire futures of people is a whole nother part of the reality too. So I would just say that we always have to be mindful that it's a social construct that has been used in order to for certain people to stay in power and other people not to have power.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction, Bernice, so thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, but I think also important foundational understanding for the ongoing conversations is, as David talked about, a term that I think is important for us to all have common understanding about is the term microaggression. And how that lives itself out in our culture, and especially within in our relationships with one another. And so I was curious if you could help us understand and have perhaps a more common understanding of microaggression, but then to also take it to another level, and perhaps how you have experienced an example of a microaggression in your day-to-day lives. Bernice, I'm going to ask you if you'll get started, because I'm betting you have some interesting examples. Unfortunately, I laugh because it's unfortunate, but yeah.
Microaggressions are what you're asking about are moments of indignity, moments when people make assumptions about you because of how you look. I don't have a lot of them because of the way I look, and people don't always know what I am. But I have been in the company of my husband is much darker skinned than I am, and so I've watched people respond to a Black man. So women pull their shoulder bag up closer as you walk down the street. I have been not addressed when I go into a store. I'm standing at a counter. Nobody comes up to me. Nobody says, "Can I help you?" They just don't see me. I become invisible. So it's either one or the other. Either you become invisible to them, or they over police you. So you go in the store and somebody follows you. They assume that you're going to steal something. So those are the kinds of things when you talk about microaggressions that most of us talk about. Stephen, I bet you have some examples too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Stephen,
the biggest way that I experienced it and have experienced it, I think comes from sort of the reality of my life in terms of the world that I've grown up in as a member of the United Church of Christ, right? Because what that's meant, and here I'm not talking about what's going on necessarily in the church, but that's been sort of a marker of the spaces in which my life has unfolded, which means that my life has unfolded significantly being anchored in a Black community, but has unfolded largely in white communities, both in terms of ministry, in terms of where I've taught, in terms of where I've lived. So the kind of microaggression that I deal with most often that continually unfolds itself is that whatever position I hold is as a consequence of white largesse and not anything that I've achieved. Right? So that whatever position I hold, whatever kind of way in which I inhabit the world, it's because of the goodwill of white people and not because of particular sort of achievement. So, a couple of examples I'll give you is when I was accepted into the PhD program at Yale University. It's no secret that many people go to Yale Divinity School because they want to get into the PhD program at Yale University. So, a particular number of times when I got in, it was a highly selective program. One time in particular, someone said, "Wow, that's really impressive. How did you do something like that? You must have really been lucky." I said, "No, graduating as the second top person in my class with a GPA of 4.0 and graduating summa cum laude is how I got into the PhD program." Right? I didn't get into the PhD, and there was no secret conspiracy among all of my professors that we're going to give him A's because we want to make sure that we're doing, the socially just thing. In fact, it was just the exact opposite if you knew the story of the Yale faculty. But I mean, that was one of the more egregious ones but I think even as we unfold, and I've unfolded my entire career, someone who's become a very dear friend of mine, he shared with me that when I went to one of the schools that I taught at, and I got there, he said, I really thought, when you came into the office, you came into the job, you really thought a lot of yourself. And I said, well, yes, I got an endowed chair because I'm very well published. In fact, one of the most published people on this faculty. I've held academic positions in the American Academy of Religion, in all sorts of things. I've worked on the National Council. So I just ran down the list. I said, so when I walked in here, why should I have behaved as if I was grateful that you all gave me a chance to get this job instead of you being grateful that you were able to get me? Right? I mean, that's what I mean by those instances in which microaggressions emerge, and that happens very often in the world. Certainly of people who are professionals, people who are upper level management, but also in terms of people who inhabit particular economic spaces. People presuming that our entire existence is a function of white largesse. And why that's an aggression is that it denies the possibility that perhaps we actually earned our way here, and perhaps the organizations that we are part of are fortunate to have us. So it's not us who needs to be grateful, saying thank you every day, but it's the institution that should say thank you for choosing us. So I think those are a couple of examples. And I mean, there are the banal examples that happen every day. When I lived in the North Shore of Chicago, up in the Evanston area, as many as you may or may not know, that's where the real wealth begins to unfold outside of downtown. The Gold Coast is the northern communities. So you have the banal stuff that you go in, and merchants clearly communicated to you that they wish you had chosen another merchant to patronize, that they wish you had chosen another restaurant to eat at. Of course, they're not rude, but they communicate that they're really not happy that you chose in their establishment. You have that everyday stuff, but, if you worry about that, you'll have a heart attack. So I, let that stuff roll off my back. But it's the other level, because a part of what ends up happening, and this is the piece about, particularly as it happens on the level of people who are moving in circles of privilege and power, is that whatever disrespect gets reflected to me redounds doubly on the people who are behind me. So what that means is that if a faculty member believes that they can diminish my achievements, how much more so do they look to diminish the achievements of the Black students in their classes?
Powerful words.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
So, one of the conversations that has been happening a lot around here amongst us, in my family, friends, is the whole concept of white privilege. And it's something that is new for many to think about. It shouldn't be, but it is. So, how would you define white privilege through the lens of your own life experience?
For me, I would say, and it's an important concept, and I think you're absolutely right. It's one that's new for a lot of people, and it's one that makes people very uncomfortable. So, I've spent many, many years, like 50 years, working on racial justice. And through the years, oftentimes I've had people say to me, well, my grandparents, they weren't even in the United States, or my great grandparents weren't even in the United States during slavery. We didn't own any slaves. We don't have anything to do with it. And so the reality is, maybe your grandparents or great grandparents didn't, but the systems of privilege that you as a white person have, that this nation was built upon, you are a part of, and you may not even be aware of it. But it's part of the reality. So, for instance, I remember when Michelle Obama said something to the effect that the Capitol and the White House had been built, actually physically built by slaves. There were people who were shocked by that. They had no idea that free labor had built these institutions, American institutions. And so so that's a very concrete example, but free labor built this country. This country was built upon the land that we took and the labor that we took. And so the wealth that has been accrued throughout generations, some of which many people were not, part of that slavery system per se, but they benefited from it. And so what has happened is, through the years, that wealth has been passed down. And so that's what white privilege is about to me. It's about not having to think about what Stephen talked about, never having to wonder, did that person, were they thinking that I didn't work hard for my PhD and everything that I've gotten? A white person would never have to think about that. And so it redounds in a lot of different ways. And it is an important and a difficult concept for many people, but I think it's really, really, really important to think about.
Thank you.
Well, let me give you a three-part answer to that. Being a Black preacher of Southern vintage, I always think about things in three parts, 3 points. So I will touch on three things. So first of all, I'm thinking about white privilege. The first thing to note is, if we're defining white privilege, what it means is an unearned access to the full range of our society's goods, of an unearned access to any place you want to live, you can live. Any store you want to shop in, you can shop in. Any college you want to go to, you can go to. Any county that you want to drive through, you can drive through. Any hotel you want to stay at in any county, you can. Now, the reason why it's unearned access is because none of those things are a function of anything that you have done. The only thing they are a function of is how the world has given a lens to see the body that you inhabit. if it is an unearned access to the full range of our social goods, the second part to recognize is what makes it unearned is that it is something that is simply imputed to you by society. So you didn't do anything to be white. You didn't work to be white. You didn't go to school to be white. It's simply the way the world has imprinted its interpretation of your body, of your family, of your community. Now, the important thing to note there, and this is why it's important, is because you didn't earn it, you can't give it back, right? You can't give it away because you're not the one who makes you white. Who makes you white is the systems within our society that interpret your body, who you are, and your history based upon definitions of whiteness and blackness. So that's what makes it unearned, is that you didn't do anything to be white. It just happens that that was your genetic code when you came into a world that is structured in ways to grant privilege to white people that it denies to others. And the third point, and this is the critical point, is because it isn't anything that you did, you can't give it away. So you will have white privilege, not because you wanted it, not because you tried to earn it, not because it was something that you achieved, but simply because of who you are. So for the person of faith, the question is, if I have this privilege, what am I going to do with it? Now, one of the ways, and I'll give you an analogy that'll help make this a bit more concrete. One of the ways that when I was teaching, and I always use this example in my theology classes, was that for most of my preaching career, and unfortunately it's still the case today, because my voice operates in a particular register of human vocality, in other words, I have a man's voice, there is a way in which when I am preaching, there are very many people who will take me more seriously, no matter what I say, than they will someone whose voice operates in a different register. And so when I came to realize that that's a function of the level of testosterone that's moving, the fact that I have a male voice is not something I chose, it's just something I have. So the question becomes, if I didn't do anything to earn it, but it's not something that I'm going to give back, because I'll be honest with you all, and this is what I tell all my classes, I believe in gender equality and I will fight for gender equality with every fiber of my being, but I will not become a eunuch. So my voice is still going to operate in this register. The question becomes, how do I use my voice? So similarly, the issue about white privilege is that it's unearned and it's something that you can't walk away from. So the faithful question to people is, how do I use it? And I can't give you an answer because the answer is as different as the worlds in which you live, the communities in which you live, the social circles with which you live. So understanding white privilege as something that is just a fact of your existence, the question isn't to try to figure out how to get away from it, because you can't, because you didn't make yourself white. The question is, what do I do with this privilege, the privilege to have access to the range of the full goods of our society? How do I use that to help people who don't have this similar privilege? Thank you.
Dr. Bernice and Dr. Ray, we're thinking about the church now, especially most specifically the American church. And in what ways has the American Christian church hindered progress towards racial justice? And is there any way in which the Christian church has, on the other hand, promoted progress towards justice? Your thoughts?
Well, I think you have to go back to the beginning and understand that the American church had a part to play when this nation at its very inception made a decision that it was going to have slavery, it was going to have free labor. And the American church played a part in that decision, accepted that decision, and then legitimized that decision by preaching about Black people being less than human. And so that's a part of our history as American Christians. And a lot of us don't know that history, and we need to find out about it because it is part of our history. And if you look in the days after the Civil War was over, in Reconstruction days and the beginnings of the KKK in the South, what did they burn? They burned crosses. And so we have to be cognizant of that and think about, what does that mean that the KKK was burning crosses as a means of terrorizing Black Americans? So that's a part of the history of that we all have inherited, and we need to own it and understand it in order to begin to take it apart, to deconstruct it.
Thank you.
Well, I think, in terms of thinking about the American church, one of the first steps is to recognize that from its very beginnings, the practice of American Christianity has held within it both the legitimization and practice of white supremacy at the same time that it's held in itself those who are trying to resist that. I often remind people that Chicago Theological Seminary was founded specifically by abolitionists who wanted to resist the growth of slavery in the territories at the time, back in the 1850s, that were coming into the United States. So what the challenge becomes for us is to recognize, as Dr. Powell has just suggested, that from the very beginning, American Christianity has participated in both the enslavement and dehumanization of Black people, but at the exact same time, American Christianity has had within it those who have resisted it, and those who have resisted it who were both Black and who were white. So why I want to sort of lift that up is because what contemporary expressions of that tradition, one of the great disservices I think that we do is by not recognizing that we are all heirs to that whole history, people get locked into narratives. So churches that are white churches get locked into the idea that their only ancestors were ones who behaved poorly. So as a consequence, they have to find a way to rationalize that poor behavior so they can still think about those people well. Well, in the same way that people behave poorly, part of your lineage as well are people who behave valiantly and righteously. And part of what I think is a big challenge for us is resisting the reductionism that comes from the way that race works, and recognize that particular communities have access to that entire history. And that in choosing who and what you will be in the current moment, you can ask of the history of American Christianity, who do we want to be like, and whose legacy do we want to carry on? Do we want to carry on the legacy of the people who were the proponents and apologists of slavery? Or do we want to carry on the legacy of the people who were the abolitionists and who became the social gospelers? Because that legacy is available to all of us. And we can choose who we want to be like. And, because one of the things that, and this may be a later question, but I'm just going to do a little excursion here, is that guilt is unproductive. Guilt doesn't lead to anything but seeking an escape. And that escape is usually through trying to find some sort of rationalization for why it is that which occurred that raised the guilt wasn't really that bad at all. So I don't find it productive. What I do find productive is people trying to lay claim to the entirety of our church reality and of our history, because you can choose to be heirs of the abolitionist, whether you are genealogically an heir or not. Because remember, the Christian faith is not in its truest form a genealogical faith, right? We're not Christians because our parents were Christians. We're Christians because the Spirit has called us to be a part of the body of Christ. So, so in terms of thinking about how those two come together, that's a piece that I'd want to pick up. It's been a problematic history, but we can get so caught up in the guilt about that problematic history that we forget that there's another history that is available to us all as well.
Thank you very much. Spanning all that history and coming to the current time, among the many things going on in this tumultuous era, and so many different things. Dr. Jackson, you mentioned earlier the disparities in, for example, maternal health and all of that. We see with COVID-19 incredible disparity, both in terms of number of cases and deaths from COVID-19, disproportionately affecting people of color. To what do you attribute that, and how can we best understand and think about that?
If I had to answer that in one word, my one word would be, to what I attribute that to is racism. And why do I say that? I say that because there are certain pre-existing conditions that seem to make COVID more deadly. And those include hypertension, diabetes, and I think it's heart disease. And if you look at the statistics of our nation when it comes to health indices, Black people, Black Americans have the highest of all of those. And why is that? Well, some of it has to do with the stress of living in a racist society, of going through those microaggressions we talked about, of dealing with the theology, of dealing with the economics, and dealing with the politics of it all. It's no wonder that most African Americans have hypertension. And so, and when it comes to that, I heard a call-in show a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, well, why can't those people just eat better? They wouldn't have diabetes if they just ate better, if they had better diet. Well, have you ever heard of food deserts? Many African Americans don't live anywhere near where there's fresh vegetables and fruits that are affordable. And so, there's all different kinds of parts of this reality. It's like looking at a prism and turning it around. But the simplest answer I have for you is it's about racism. It's about racism for individuals, but it's also about racism in terms of the healthcare system of this nation. And so that why do you have maternal those statistics I talked about? Well, it's because of the systems that have, and also the fact that many people in this country can't really afford good health care.
Thank you.
Well, I think I'm going to approach answering the question from a slightly different point of view, and I want to approach it theologically. And the reason why you see the disproportionate lethality of COVID-19 is the same reason why there was a disproportionate lethality when we were in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, why there is a disproportionate lethality in terms of natural disaster. And that is when we live in a fallen world that has been shaped by sin, specifically here the sin of racism, every structure of creation turns against those who are the victims of that structural sin. So when, we find this in scriptural images as well, is that when one plague visits a community, it's always followed by other plagues that simply diminish and annihilate the community. So, theologically, and a way of thinking about it that connects it with faith, is that the higher lethality rate for COVID-19 in these other instances is because we live operation of sin, but in very specific ways, the operation of sin as racism, such that any destructive force that takes on life within our society will visit itself in manifold ways onto those communities and people that have already been structurally marginalized within that community. So, certainly there are ways to talk about it in other ways, but I think that if we don't include, when we're talking to church people, a sort of theological lens to understand this, then we haven't gone the full way. So you need both of them. So, you need the one that Dr. Powell was talking about in terms of structural inequality, in terms of the way racism has worked to shape communities with food deserts. Together, I think, help us begin to raise the questions that we ought to be raising as Christians and people of faith. And that is not only what is the material way we understand it, but how do we use our faith to help us respond to it? And if we understand what's going on as something that is demonstrating the fall in our midst, then the one thing that Scripture teaches us, and this is a term I use a lot in my teaching, is that in the face of evil, what Christians are called to do is to materialize good, to make good material in the world in their circumstance. So as we're looking at the question of lethality and trying to understand why that is the case, that becomes the reason why we work on healthcare disparities, because we're trying to materialize good. That's the reason why we try to work on food deserts where there is no healthy food, because we're trying to materialize good, not because it's a good socially conscious thing to do, but it's impelled by our faith, because in the midst of evil and in the midst of the fall, what we are called to do is to materialize good so that God's love might shine in the world.
Thank you very much.
Bernice, we were having a sidebar earlier about asking the question of what are we going to do? Because I think that's a driving force, not only for all of us and certainly people of faith, but I know it's a question that resides in the heart of this congregation because we know this church so well. And to both of your points, one of the things I'm most proud of and one of the things I want to say to you is since the COVID-19 pandemic has begun, this congregation has donated over $50,000 to 2 food banks doing work in areas that are food deserts. And I think that those are really important things that we have to keep in front of us, because that work is so vital and it's never ending. And one of the conversations that, in addition to these conversations on race and privilege, that I'm going to be having in the coming weeks is with the CEO of one of our local food banks, because those conversations to keep in front of us are really important. And Stephen, I wonder if you're about to coin a new term of a health desert, because even though I think that wasn't what you intended to say, you actually got my mind thinking about where are the places that we're not providing the level of care beyond the obvious, but really even providing the care that's needed for the most basic level of care. And so you have me thinking about that as well. I think about the fact that it has gotten to the point for me personally, and I think I can reflect this team, it's really difficult to turn on the news for a lot of reasons. I don't know that I can watch the video of George Floyd's life wasting away literally in front of us one more time. It's just so much now. So I think one of the things that we try to also talk about around here is hope. And so the two of you have given us, you've been so gracious with your time. You've given us so much to think about, so much to chew on, and so a solid foundation for these conversations. So I'm deeply grateful. So the final question I would ask you tonight is, in these days, with all that we're facing in these conversations and with all that we're dealing with, what gives you hope in these days?
For me, I guess I would say there are a couple of things. And hope is a very important word. It's a word that we throw around a lot without really thinking about what it really means. Because it's not the same as optimism. It's something that's deeply connected to our relationship with God. So the first thing I have to say is, what always gives me hope is God. Even when I feel hopeless, when I can't see the way forward, I trust that God can. And so for me, that's my first response to that question. But I think there are a couple of other things. I think for me, the young people, and most of our churches don't have a lot of young people in them anymore. And so I just really try to spend time and encourage anybody else to spend some time talking to some young people, because they have a different way of looking at things than some of us older folks do. And they're out in the streets, and they're out in the streets in a way that they have not been in a very, very, very long time. And they weren't out in the streets one day or 2 days. They've been out in the streets every day. We're now at 14 days. And, that really says, and they're out in the streets in the midst of a pandemic. And so that gives me a lot of hope, because it says to me that they are requiring us, who are older folks, they are requiring us to rethink. And this goes back to the initial question, to rethink who we are and what we want this world to be. And so that gives me a lot of hope. The other thing that gives me hope is, and this is my final point, I think that we're at a moment where we might really see some significant change. I mean, I've spent 40 years working on criminal justice issues, most of them, all of them in the United Church of Christ. And in those 40 years, the chasm that I have seen that is the largest, the biggest, the deepest, the widest, is between white American concept of the criminal justice system and African American concept of the criminal justice system. And so often, you're trying to build this bridge across this chasm, and you get the two ends of the bridge almost there, and then all of a sudden something would happen and you could never make it meet. Well, I kind of feel like they're meeting now. And there's a piece of legislation that the Congress, that the House, many of the folks in the House are putting forth. It's called the Justice and Policy Act. And I have hope that act has some significant changes around criminal. I don't ever in my lifetime or in anybody else's lifetime want to see another video of a George Floyd on the ground being murdered in front of the world. I don't ever want to see that again. And so my hope is that we won't see that again, that this act will pass that folks from Naples and Venice and Tampa and Jacksonville and Vero Beach and Coral Gables will say to their House and their Senate reps, this has got to pass. We've got to see concrete changes. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry, but hope requires a long answer.
Please never apologize for hope whatsoever. So thank you, Bernice, again. Stephen, your thoughts?
Well, I'll start by saying that hope for me is hard to come by these days because in my previous life as a professor, I found my hope in the faces of my students and in the reports of the people that I have taught, because I felt that whatever I was doing, I was able to at least get some glimmer of what that might look like in the world. As the president of a seminary, I can talk about my students at CTS, but that's not the same as the 30 students who are sitting in front of me for a whole semester. So I think that in these days where, just because of where I'm at in the world, hope is hard to come by. I'm glad when I find it. And one of the places, and the primary place that I find hope these days, is in the faces of those who are protesting. And what I mean by that is that, at least in my lifetime, and I think probably the first protest march I went on was 40 years ago, at least in my lifetime, I don't recall the fervent way in which young people and other people of all races and ethnicities have responded to this particular moment, and not just in a passing way. Because I think that what my hopefulness is that perhaps, and only time will tell, but perhaps there is a generation that has given up on the idea that we can have separate destinies as a nation, that we can have separate destinies as a people. Because I think my hopefulness is that if there's a generation of people who understand that we are interwoven in terms of the destiny of whatever this nation will become, then the possibilities for what we will become so much more vast than the histories out of which we believe that we could have different and separate destinies and still all be able to flourish. Because the ways in which we've lived as a nation has diminished us all. And I think that where I'm finding hope is, it seems, at least to me, from what I've seen, the protest march I was on, the various reports that I'm seeing, my social media blogs, et cetera, is that there's a generation of people who understand that their future is intertwined and that without one another, they have no future. And so that's where I'm finding years, is the ways in which, even in the midst of social struggle, and even in the midst of trying to do justice work, folk hadn't gotten to the point where they understood that we have a future together, or ultimately we have no future at all.
Well, I will say on behalf of this team and on behalf of this congregation that part of what gives me hope are colleagues and friends who are so generous with their time, who have such a rich tradition and history of opening our eyes to the inequity, inequalities of our nation, and yet still are willing to hold us to the gospel and who lovingly show us new ways of being. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you to both of you for being with us. Thank you for your friendship of Naples United Church of Christ, and thank you for your personal friendship with each of us I am hopeful that we will move past this pandemic sooner rather than later and that we get to see one another in person. But until then, may God's peace be with you, and know that we hold you in our hearts and that we have deep gratitude for you. And so thank you for your time and for your wisdom tonight. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. God bless.
Yes, thank you. God bless. So good to see you again, Bernice.
You too, Stephen.
Okay, y'all take care. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And we want to thank you for being with us for this first conversation. I want to invite you back next Wednesday. I'm going to be having a fun conversation that I've been looking forward to with a childhood friend of mine who now leads University United Methodist Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We're going to talk about growing up in suburban Houston, Texas, me as a white kid, Justin as a black kid, and where life has taken us now. And so as these conversations unfold and continue, I hope that you'll join us next Wednesday at 5 p.m. for the continued sacred conversations on race and privilege here at Naples United Church of Christ. Until then, we hope that you remain safe and you will join us again for worship on Sunday and next Wednesday. Thanks so much.